Hungry dog won't stop barking for food. Moments later, what police do leaves everyone in tears. Thunder rolled across Atlanta's darkened sky as Sarah Collins tightened her grip on Max's leash, squinting through the rain that pelted their evening patrol route. The Belgian Malinois had been acting strange for the past 20 minutes, his usual disciplined demeanor replaced by persistent barking that echoed through the storm-ravaged streets. This wasn't like him at all. Max was one of the Atlanta PD's most decorated K9 officers, known for his steady nerves and laser focus. In their 5 years together, she'd never seen him this agitated during a routine patrol. "Easy, boy," Sarah murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears, a gesture that usually calmed him instantly. But Max pulled away, his amber eyes fixed on something in the distance, his barks growing more urgent. A flash of lightning illuminated the residential street ahead, revealing fallen branches and debris from the afternoon's savage storm. The Weather Service had warned about this system, but nobody had expected it to hit Piedmont Park's historic district with such ferocity. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Unit K94, what's your status? Getting reports of unusual activity in your sector." "Collins here. Max is..." Sarah hesitated, watching her partner's unusual behavior. 5 years of working together had taught her to trust his instincts. But this was different. Max wasn't just alert, he was agitated, almost desperate. "Something's not right. He's signaling, but I can't identify the trigger." Her mind flashed back to their training days at the Atlanta Police Department's K9 facility. She remembered the endless hours spent learning to read each other's signals, building the foundation of trust that had made them one of the department's most effective teams. Their instructor, Sergeant Martinez, had pulled her aside one day after Max had detected a hidden training subject long before any other dog. "That's not just training," Martinez had said. "That's pure instinct. Some dogs don't just detect danger, they feel it in their souls." The rain intensified, drumming against her patrol car's roof as Sarah tried to make sense of Max's behavior. She'd seen him work countless cases, from tracking missing persons to detecting narcotics. But this was different. His entire body was tense, his barks carrying a note of urgency she'd never heard before. "Here," she said, pulling an energy bar from her tactical vest. "Is this what you want, boy?" But Max turned his head away from the offered food, something he'd never done before. His barking intensified, and he lunged forward with such force that Sarah had to brace herself against the car. "Hold position," she commanded, but for the first time in their partnership, Max completely ignored her. His muscles tensed beneath his tactical vest as he pulled harder, leading her toward a cluster of older homes on Piedmont Avenue. The historic houses, with their Victorian architecture and wraparound porches, usually stood proud against Atlanta's skyline. Tonight, they loomed like dark sentinels in the storm. "Dispatch, I'm going to investigate on foot. Max is..." She paused as her partner let out another series of urgent barks. "He's trying to tell me something. Request backup at my location." The shadows lengthened as they moved deeper into the residential area, passing houses damaged by the storm. Max's pace quickened, his nails clicking against the wet pavement. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her flashlight as they approached a partially collapsed Victorian home, its windows dark and shutters hanging askew. The front yard was littered with debris, branches, roofing tiles, and what looked like pieces of a neighbor's fence. That's when she heard it, barely audible above the storm and Max's barking, a sound that made her blood run cold. A faint cry coming from somewhere beneath the house. Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken as years of training kicked in. "This is Officer Collins," she spoke rapidly into her radio. "Possible civilians in danger at 1242 Piedmont, requesting immediate backup and rescue units." She turned to Max, who was now pawing at the ground near a cellar entrance, his barking more frantic than ever. "You knew, didn't you, boy? This wasn't about food at all." A crash from within the house made them both freeze. The building was groaning, shifting in the saturated ground. Sarah's flashlight beam caught the rising water seeping from beneath the cellar doors. and in that moment, she realized they didn't have time to wait for backup. The storm drain must have backed up, turning the cellar into a death trap. "Help!" The cry was stronger now, accompanied by the sound of splashing. "Please, somebody, we're down here." Sarah reached down to release Max's leash, her hand lingering for a moment on his rain-soaked fur. Their eyes met in the darkness, and she saw the same determination there that had made her choose him from all the other dogs in the K9 program. "Show me," she whispered, and Max bounded forward without hesitation, leading her toward what would become the most challenging rescue of their careers. The storm intensified overhead, but Sarah barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to her partner's bark and the desperate voices from below. Every instinct told her the structure wasn't stable, that protocol demanded waiting for the rescue team. But she also knew that in situations like this, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. What Sarah couldn't know, as she followed Max toward the cellar doors, was that this night would test not just their skills, but the very foundation of trust between Handler and K9. And somewhere in the darkness below, a family's survival hung in the balance, their fate resting in the paws of a dog who refused to stay silent. The rain pounded against her back as she reached for the cellar doors, her flashlight beam revealing the rising water within. Max's barks had changed now, shorter, more directed, the same pattern he used when he'd located a target. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was to come. Sometimes, she realized, the most important messages come not in words, but in the persistent bark of a partner who knows that time is running out. Thunder crackled overhead as Sarah and Max descended into the flooded cellar, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the murky darkness. The water was already waist-deep, its icy grip sending shivers through her body. Max swam beside her, his powerful strokes guided by an instinct that had already proven life-saving. "Hello, Atlanta PD! Call out if you can hear me!" Sarah's voice echoed against the concrete walls. The cellar was larger than she'd expected, stretching beneath the entire foundation of the Victorian home. Support beams groaned ominously above them as another crack of thunder shook the ground. The response came immediately. A chorus of desperate voices from the far corner. "We're here! Please hurry!" A woman's voice, followed by what sounded like a child's cry. Max barked in response, changing direction with purpose. Sarah's radio crackled with static. "Collins, rescue units are 10 minutes out. Building inspector advises immediate evacuation. Structure is compromised." The voice of her sergeant was tense. "Get out of there now!" But Sarah could already see them through the beam of her flashlight, a family of 4 huddled on a makeshift platform of old furniture. A mother clutching 2 children, and an elderly man struggling to keep his balance as water lapped at their feet. The platform wouldn't hold much longer. "I've found them," Sarah reported back, fighting to keep her voice steady. 4 civilians. We need immediate medical response." She clicked off the radio before anyone could order her out again. The elderly man spoke first, his voice trembling. "The storm drain backed up so fast. We tried to get out, but the doors were stuck." He gestured to a nasty gash on his leg. "I fell trying to break them open." Sarah assessed the situation quickly. The water was rising faster now, and the main entrance was already submerged. Max circled the family, his training kicking in as he herded them closer together, keeping them calm. "There's another way out," the mother said suddenly, pointing to a small window near the ceiling. "We couldn't reach it, but maybe—" Her voice trailed off as another support beam creaked ominously. Sarah's mind raced back to her training. Standard procedure was to wait for backup, but the groaning structure above told her they didn't have that luxury. She could already see hairline cracks spreading across the ceiling. "Max, find us a path!" The command was barely out of her mouth before her partner was moving, swimming in a deliberate pattern through the rising water. His behavior training had included searching for structural weaknesses, a skill that now seemed providential. The next few minutes were a blur of coordinated movement. Sarah helped the children onto a floating piece of plywood, using it as a makeshift raft while Max guided them toward the window. The older boy, no more than 10, kept his sister calm by telling her to watch the brave police dog. But as they reached the window, Sarah's heart sank. It was higher than she'd estimated, and too narrow for the adults. The children might fit, but they'd need help from the outside. Almost as if reading her thoughts, Max barked sharply and disappeared beneath the water. "What's he doing?" the elderly man asked, panic edging into his voice as the water reached his chest. Sarah trusted her partner, but fear crept in as seconds stretched into minutes. Then suddenly, Max's barking echoed from above. He'd found another way out. The ceiling groaned again, and chunks of concrete splashed into the water. Sarah made a split-second decision. Change of plans. "Everyone follow me now." She took the lead, guiding the family through the flooded cellar, following Max's increasingly urgent barks. They found him at a partially collapsed section of wall, where the foundation had given way to create a narrow but navigable slope to the surface. Sarah could see rescue lights flashing above through the opening. One by one, she helped them up the precarious incline. The children first, then their mother, and finally, with the help of rescue workers who had just arrived, the elderly man. As Sarah turned to follow, a massive crack echoed through the cellar. "Officer Collins!" someone shouted from above. "The whole thing's coming down!" But Max wasn't moving. He stood rigid, staring into the darkness of the cellar, ears forward. Sarah knew that pose. He'd found something else. "I need 2 minutes!" she shouted up, already moving back into the water. "Max, show me!" He led her to a small alcove they'd missed earlier, where the water hadn't risen as high. There, huddled in the corner and nearly unconscious, was a teenage girl, the family's eldest daughter who'd been trapped when she tried to find their cat. The rescue itself was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Sarah barely remembered getting the girl to the surface, just the final, desperate scramble as the cellar finally collapsed behind them, and Max's solid presence pushing them to safety. Later, as paramedics treated the family for hypothermia and minor injuries, Sarah watched Max accept gentle pets from the children he'd helped save. His fur was still dripping, but his posture was proud, alert, back to the professional K9 officer she knew so well. "We thought they were stress barks," one of her fellow officers admitted, shaking his head. Like he was spooked by the storm. Sarah knelt beside her partner, pulling him close. "Max doesn't get spooked," she said quietly. "He was trying to tell us something. We just had to learn to listen." The mother of the family approached, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "How can we ever thank you both?" Sarah watched as Max gently nuzzled the woman's hand, his earlier urgency replaced by a calm reassurance. In that moment, she understood something profound about their partnership. Sometimes the most important messages aren't delivered in words or signals, but in the persistent bark of a partner who refuses to give up until every life is saved. Above them, the storm began to clear, and the first responders started packing their gear. But Sarah lingered, one hand resting on Max's head, knowing that this night would be remembered not for the dramatic rescue, but for the unshakable trust between a handler and her K9. A trust that had turned a seeming false alarm into 6 lives saved. As they walked back to their patrol car, Max's tail wagged slightly, and Sarah could have sworn she saw a hint of satisfaction in his amber eyes. After all, he'd known all along what needed to be done. Sometimes, she realized, it just takes a persistent bark to change everything. Sarah sat in the back of the ambulance, a thermal blanket draped over her shoulders, watching Max receive a thorough check from the department's veterinarian. Despite her protests, protocol demanded they both be examined after the rescue. Her mind wandered back to their early days together, a memory triggered by Max's unwavering focus earlier that night. 5 years ago, at the Atlanta Police Department's K9 training center, Sarah had stood among 20 hopeful handlers, each paired with their potential partners. She remembered the skeptical looks when she'd chosen Max, the youngest and most energetic of the Belgian Malinois puppies. Sergeant Martinez had pulled her aside that day. "Collins, that pup's got something special," Martinez had said, watching Max practically vibrate with enthusiasm. But he's going to challenge every assumption you have about K9 training. Are you ready for that? The memories shifted to their first major breakthrough. 3 months into training, during a complex search exercise, Max had completely ignored the prescribed search pattern. Instead, he'd bolted straight to a hidden training subject who was experiencing a genuine medical emergency. The subject, a veteran K9 officer, had been concealing symptoms of heat exhaustion, determined to complete his role in the exercise. "Your dog knew before any of us," the officer had said later in the hospital. "Kept barking and wouldn't leave me alone, wouldn't even take his favorite treats." Sarah's attention snapped back to the present as Max padded over, now cleared by the vet. He rested his head on her knee, his amber eyes reflecting the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. The family they'd rescued was being transported to the hospital, all stable, all alive, thanks to Max's inexplicable persistence. "Officer Collins?" A young paramedic approached, clipboard in hand. "We need to document the timeline of events. You mentioned Max's behavior changed about 20 minutes before you found the house." Sarah nodded, absently scratching behind Max's ears. "He started barking for food. At least, that's what we thought. It's the same pattern he uses when he's alerting to something, but there was no obvious trigger." The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Martinez's arrival. Despite the late hour, he'd come personally after hearing about the rescue. His face was grave as he surveyed the collapsed structure. "Talk me through it, Collins. What made you trust his signal when everything pointed to a false alarm?" Sarah stood, her muscles protesting after the night's exertion. Max immediately assumed a perfect heel position beside her. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Martinez nodded, his expression softening as he watched Max maintain his professional demeanor despite his obvious exhaustion. 4 years ago, during that warehouse fire in Buckhead, Max found those kids in the basement before the smoke was even visible from outside. Everyone said it was luck. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. But it wasn't. He knew, just like tonight. Martinez's radio crackled with an update from the structural engineer. The house's foundation had been compromised days before the storm, a slow degradation that had gone unnoticed. The flooding had merely accelerated an inevitable collapse. "The family had no warning," the engineer's voice reported. "Another hour, maybe less, and the whole structure would have come down with them inside." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She remembered her own father, a firefighter lost in a structural collapse 20 years ago. The official report had noted that the building had shown signs of instability that human observers had missed. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "I think Max was reading subtle changes in the air currents, maybe picking up microscopic particles from the degrading foundation, combined with the trapped family's distress." Martinez held up a hand, a familiar gleam in his eye, the same look he'd had during their training days when a piece of the puzzle fell into place. The persistent bark wasn't about food at all. He was using the only alert signal he thought would get immediate attention. Max's ears perked up at their discussion of his behavior, his tail wagging slightly. Sarah felt a surge of pride and love for her partner. Their bond had been forged in countless training sessions, strengthened through daily patrols, and proven in moments of crisis. "Collins?" Martinez said, his voice taking on the tone she remembered from their training days. "What you two did tonight, that's not just the result of training. That's something deeper, something we can't teach." As if to emphasize the point, Max suddenly turned his head toward the collapsed house, his posture alert but calm. Moments later, a faint meow emerged from the rubble. The family's missing cat had survived, finding its own way out through the chaos. Sarah watched as Max, despite his exhaustion, gently approached the frightened feline. His earlier urgency was replaced by the careful movements they'd practiced in countless sensitive search operations. The cat, instead of fleeing, allowed itself to be guided to safety. "That's what I saw in him 5 years ago," Sarah said, more to herself than to Martinez. "Not just his ability to find things, but his understanding of what needs to be found." As the first light of dawn began to break over Atlanta's skyline, Sarah realized that this night had taught her something profound about her partnership with Max. Their success wasn't just built on training or even experience. It was founded on an unshakable trust in each other's instincts. Martinez smiled, watching as Max returned to his position beside Sarah. "Some partnerships are formed in training," he said, "but the best ones, they're forged in moments like these, when everything comes down to trusting what you can't explain." The night's events would be recorded in official reports as a successful swiftwater rescue. But Sarah knew the true story was much simpler: a dog who refused to stay silent, and a handler who learned to listen not just with her ears, but with her heart. "Officer Collins, we've got another situation." Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the quiet morning air. He spread a map across the tactical table, pointing to an area just north of their location. 2 more houses reported flooding in their basements, storm drain systems completely backed up. Sarah felt Max tense beside her, his ears forward, body completely alert despite their exhaustion. She'd learned to read these subtle changes in his posture. This wasn't just interest, this was recognition. "The houses are here and here," Reynolds continued, marking the locations. "Rescue teams are stretched thin, with flood responses across the city. We need to make a call on which location to hit first." Sarah studied the map, her tactical training kicking in. Both houses were in the same historic district as their previous rescue, both likely sharing similar structural vulnerabilities. But something about Max's behavior nagged at her. "Sir, what's the status of the storm drain maintenance records for this area?" Reynolds pulled up digital files on a nearby laptop. "System's old, really old. Last major renovation was..." He paused, frowning. 30 years ago." Sarah's mind raced back to their K9 training sessions on urban search and rescue. They'd learned about how underground systems could create connected spaces during floods, invisible channels that could turn separate basements into a single deadly trap. Max suddenly barked, that same urgent tone from earlier, and pulled toward the door. Sarah's heart rate spiked. "Captain, I think these houses might be connected underground. If the drain system is compromised, we could be looking at a chain reaction." Reynolds finished, already reaching for his radio. "But we still need to choose which house to approach first. Structural engineers won't be on site for another 40 minutes. Sarah looked at Max, remembering how his instincts had saved lives just hours ago. He met her gaze with unwavering focus, and in that moment, she made her decision. "Sir, request permission to split the difference. I can take Max to assess both locations quickly, determine which is more critical. His nose will tell us more than any delayed engineering report." Reynolds hesitated. Protocol dictated waiting for proper structural assessment after their earlier close call. But he'd also seen the results of trusting this particular K9 team's judgment. "You've got 15 minutes, he said finally. "Any sign of instability, you pull back immediately." "That's an order, Collins." Sarah and Max moved swiftly through the debris-strewn streets, her mind racing through possible scenarios. The first house appeared stable, its Victorian architecture still proud, despite the water seeping from its foundation. But Max's reaction was subdued, alert but not urgent. The second house was different. Before they even reached the front gate, Max's posture changed dramatically. His barking took on that same insistent quality from their earlier rescue, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. "Collins to command. Second location is priority. Multiple heartbeats detected by Max. Signs of..." She stopped as a low rumble emanated from beneath the house. "Sir, we need immediate response. Ground's shifting." "Negative, Collins. Hold position and wait for backup." "That's a direct order." But Sarah could see water bubbling up through cracks in the foundation, and Max was already moving toward the cellar entrance, his training warring with his instinct to act immediately. A scream pierced the morning air, high-pitched, desperate, a child's voice. Then another rumble, louder this time. Sarah's hand went to her radio, then paused. Following protocol meant waiting for backup. Following her partner's instincts had already saved 6 lives today. In that moment, facing what could be the most consequential decision of her career, Sarah Collins chose to trust the bond that had never failed her. "Max," she said quietly, "show me." Together, they descended into the flooded cellar, knowing that their choice would either save lives or end careers. But as Max led her through the rising water with unwavering certainty, Sarah realized that some decisions transcend protocol. They come from a place of absolute trust between partners who share not just training, but a purpose. What they found in that cellar would challenge everything they knew about rescue operations, testing not just their skills, but the very limits of what a handler and K9 could achieve together. And somewhere above them, a clock was ticking, counting down to a moment when their impossible decision would prove either catastrophically wrong or miraculously right. The water continued to rise, and in its murky depths, Sarah and Max faced the consequences of their choice. Sometimes they both knew the hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong. They're between what's safe and what's necessary. And in those moments, all you can do is trust the partner who's never led you astray. The beam of Sarah's flashlight revealed 3 children huddled on a makeshift platform of old furniture, the youngest barely keeping his head above the rising water. Their babysitter, a teenage girl, struggled to hold them all together as the platform shifted precariously. "Atlanta PD! Hold on, we're coming to you!" Sarah called out, fighting against the current that now reached her chest. Max swam beside her, his powerful strokes cutting through the turbulent water. A thunderous crack echoed through the cellar. Sarah's flashlight beam caught chunks of ceiling, falling into the water around them. The structural damage was worse than they'd feared. The entire house was coming down. "The stairs collapsed," the teenage girl shouted, her voice trembling. "We tried to get out, but..." She was cut off by another ominous groan from above. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Collins, get out now. Engineering reports show the whole block's foundation is compromised. The houses are connected by old tunnel systems." Max suddenly barked and changed direction, swimming toward a far corner of the cellar. Sarah had learned to trust these sudden inspirations. They'd saved lives before, but with the ceiling literally falling around them, every second was a gamble. "Kids, we're going to have to swim," Sarah announced, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "One at a time. Max will guide us." The oldest child, a boy about 12, went first. Sarah helped him into the water, surprised by his composure. "Follow the dog," she instructed. "He knows the way." Max led them through the darkness with unwavering confidence, weaving between falling debris. They reached what appeared to be an old maintenance tunnel, a relic of the house's historic past. Water flowed through it rapidly, but it seemed stable. 2 more trips, 2 more children safely guided through the treacherous waters. Each time, Max adjusted his pace to the child's swimming ability, staying close enough to help if needed. The teenage babysitter was last, her fear finally showing as she entered the water. That's when the real disaster struck. A massive section of ceiling collapsed, sending a wave through the cellar that slammed them against the tunnel entrance. Sarah lost her grip on her flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. "Max!" Sarah's voice was barely audible above the rushing water. "Find us a way out." But Max had already disappeared into the tunnel. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah felt the weight of her decision to trust him crushing down with the debris around them. Then she heard it, his bark echoing back through the tunnel, showing them the path. They pushed forward through the darkness, guided only by Max's voice and the faint light filtering through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. The babysitter clung to Sarah's tactical vest, both of them fighting against the current. Suddenly, Max's barking changed tone, a warning they'd practiced countless times in training. Sarah reached out blindly and found what he'd detected, a partially collapsed section of tunnel, barely wide enough to pass through. "We have to go under," Sarah realized. The gap above the water was too small. "Take a deep breath. Max will guide us." They submerged into the pitch-black water. Sarah felt Max's fur brush against her hand as he led them through the underwater passage. Her lungs burned, muscles screaming for air. Just when she thought they couldn't hold on any longer, they surfaced in a different cellar, one that still had access to the street. Emergency crews were waiting at the cellar doors, alerted by the barking that had guided them to this location. As they helped the children and babysitter to safety, Sarah turned to thank her partner. But Max wasn't beside her. A muffled bark echoed from the tunnel they'd just escaped. Max had gone back, perhaps hearing something they'd missed. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah dove back into the water. She found him in the original cellar, helping a small dog that had been trapped behind some fallen furniture. Even in the midst of disaster, Max's commitment to saving every life remained unshakable. Their final swim to safety was a blur of exhaustion and determination. When they finally emerged, the first house had completely collapsed, the thunder of its destruction echoing through the morning air. Captain Reynolds was waiting for them, his face a mix of relief and barely contained anger. "Collins, you disobeyed a direct order." Sarah stood at attention, water streaming from her uniform, one hand resting on Max's head. "Yes, sir, we did." The captain looked at the rescued children being treated by paramedics, then at the small dog Max had refused to abandon. His expression softened slightly. "Write your report. We'll discuss this tomorrow." As the sun rose fully over Atlanta, Sarah sat with Max in their patrol car, both completely drained but alive. She pulled out her phone, showing Max a message that had just come through. All the rescued children were safe, being treated for mild hypothermia, but otherwise unharmed. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to her partner. "About the tunnel, about all of it." Max simply rested his head on her lap, his eyes already alert for the next call, the next life to save. In that moment, Sarah understood that their partnership wasn't just about following orders or protocols. It was about trusting each other when everything else fell apart. The last path had been the hardest, but they'd walked it together, as they always would. And in the end, that made all the difference. Sarah stood at attention in Chief Thompson's office, Max perfectly positioned at her side. The room was crowded with department brass and local media, not their usual audience. Through the large windows, she could see the families they'd rescued waiting in the lobby, including all 3 children and their teenage babysitter. The morning had started differently than most. During their pre-shift routine, Sarah had noticed Max's heightened awareness, his usual professional demeanor carrying an almost imperceptible excitement. Even their morning training exercises in Piedmont Park had felt special, as if Max somehow knew this day would be significant. "Officer Collins," Chief Thompson began, his usually stern face softened by a slight smile. "Your actions during last week's storm have been thoroughly reviewed. While your decision to disobey direct orders initially raised serious concerns." He paused, glancing at Max, who remained perfectly still despite the tension in the room. "The outcome speaks for itself. 8 lives saved, including a family that would have been lost if not for Max's persistent barking." Sarah felt a surge of pride as she remembered that night. The investigation had revealed that the Victorian house's foundation had been critically compromised days before the storm. Max had somehow detected the structural instability before any human instruments could measure it. The engineering report, now part of their official record, described it as an extraordinary demonstration of canine sensory capabilities. Eek. Furthermore, the chief continued, your discovery of the connected tunnel system has led to a crucial infrastructure review of our historic districts. What started as a seemingly routine patrol has potentially prevented countless future tragedies. Your actions have redefined how we think about K9 capabilities. The door opened and Sergeant Martinez entered, carrying something in his hands. Sarah's old training instructor's presence brought back vivid memories. She remembered his words from their first day together. A K9 unit isn't about commands and responses. It's about building a partnership that transcends conventional understanding. In light of these events, Thompson announced, the department is establishing a new training protocol for K9 units. We're calling it the MAX protocol, teaching handlers to trust their partner's instincts even when they seem to contradict standard procedure. Sometimes, as you've shown us, the most crucial warnings come from those who can't speak in words. Martinez stepped forward, presenting a special commendation collar for Max, decorated with the department's highest honors. As Sarah attached it to her partner's neck, she noticed the engraving, "For exceptional service and unwavering dedication to saving lives." Max's tail wagged slightly, a rare break from his professional demeanor. The families entered, led by the teenage babysitter who'd shown such courage during the rescue. Behind them came the elderly couple from the first house, each family accompanied by newly adopted shelter dogs, a touching tribute to the K9 unit that had saved their lives. "We've started a foundation," the babysitter announced, her voice steady despite her emotions, "for training rescue dogs and supporting K9 units. Because what happened that night wasn't just about being saved, it was about understanding that sometimes the most important warnings come from those we might not always listen to." She stepped forward, presenting Sarah with documentation showing that the foundation had already secured funding for training 5 new K9 units, with a focus on disaster response and urban search and rescue. "Your story has inspired departments across the country," she explained. "They're all asking about the dog who wouldn't stop barking." The youngest child stepped forward, clutching a drawing of Max leading people to safety through the storm. "Mom says he's a hero," the boy said, "but he doesn't want a cape or anything. He just wants to help." His sister joined him, carrying a photo album documenting their rescue and recovery, dedicated to the partners who heard what we couldn't say. Later that afternoon, as they returned to patrol, Sarah took Max to their special spot in Piedmont Park. The new collar gleamed in the setting sun, but Max seemed more interested in scanning their sector, already focused on the next potential call. They drove through the streets of Atlanta, passing the historic district where their adventure had begun. The collapsed houses were being rebuilt, stronger than before, with new safety measures inspired by their experience. Workers waved as they passed, many now familiar with the K9 unit that had changed the department's approach to rescue operations. A call came over the radio, another situation requiring K9 assistance. As they responded, Sarah remembered the lesson they'd taught the entire department. Sometimes the most powerful communication isn't in words or signals, but in the persistent bark of a partner who refuses to be silent when lives are at stake. The foundation they'd inspired was already making waves. 3 more police departments had adopted the Max protocol, and a national conference on K9 training had requested Sarah as a keynote speaker. But none of that mattered to Max. He was focused solely on their next mission, the next life to save. Max sat up straighter, already alert to their new assignment. In the end, they were just doing their job, a handler and her K9, ready to face whatever challenges came their way. But they'd shown the world that true heroism often comes in the quietest forms, in the unshakable bond between partners who trust each other without question. The sun set over Atlanta as they patrolled, 2 silent heroes going about their duty, ready for the next time they'd be needed. Because that's what partners do. They listen to each other, trust each other, and never stop trying to make their city a little bit safer, one bark at a time. And somewhere in the city, a new generation of K9 units was being trained differently, learning that sometimes the most important messages come not from protocol or procedure, but from the heart of a partner who knows exactly what needs to be done. As they responded to their next call, Sarah glanced at Max, seeing in his determined expression the same unwavering dedication that had saved so many lives that stormy night. The commendation collar might recognize their past achievements, but for Max, the real reward was the work itself, the chance to serve, to protect, and to prove that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that barks instead of speaks.